Roger Awan-Scully. So what I'm going to talk about is what the public has made of it all. We know that the United Kingdom and indeed Wales voted to leave the European Union on the 23rd of June 2 years ago. So just over 2 years on, what I want to look at is some of the latest evidence about what do people think now about Brexit. Now, previous research that's been conducted on this until a few months ago suggested a number of different things. First of all, it has suggested that since the referendum, within Wales and indeed across the UK, the country has remained evenly divided on the question of whether Britain should remain in the European Union or leave the European Union. There's not been a substantial change in public attitudes. There's not been an emergent public consensus in support of the decision that was made in the referendum 2 years ago, or a clear majority opposition to that. Moreover, that aggregate stability has reflected substantial individual level stability. Sometimes you can see in opinion polls where the headline numbers don't change a lot over time, but actually there are quite a lot of individual people. So a whole bunch of people move from one direction to another, but that's balanced out by a roughly equal number of people moving in the opposite direction. That's not what we've seen with Brexit. If you look at the individual level evidence, what it suggested hitherto is that overwhelmingly very few people have changed their minds, and the vast majority of people have remained of the position they were 2 years ago. People who voted Remain and supported Remain in June 2016 are still pro-Remain. People who voted Leave are still favouring the UK leaving the European Union. And indeed, beneath this headline division on the basic question of should the UK remain or leave in the EU, in the details of the evidence, we see further divisions between Remainers and Leavers. They don't just disagree on the basic question of whether the UK should stay in the EU. They also disagree substantially on, if the UK leaves the EU, what sort of Brexit should we be pursuing. They have radically different expectations of what the material, practical consequences will be of Brexit, with Remainers being much more pessimistic than Leavers about what Brexit will mean for the country and indeed for their own and their families' living standards. And even in some of the evidence that's been gathered, we've found significant differences between Remainers and Leavers on basic questions of political process, how the process of the UK withdrawing from the European Union should be handled politically. So all of this evidence has suggested hitherto very deep, substantial and persisting divisions within the public on the question of Brexit. So what I'm going to do now is bring the story up to date with some of the very latest evidence. First of all, starting with evidence in Wales. This evidence comes from the most recent opinion poll conducted in Wales, the Welsh Political Barometer poll conducted by YouGov for ITV Wales and the Wales Governance Centre and published a couple of weeks ago. And first of all, I want to look at the evidence, a question we've asked consistently from September 2016 about, do you think there should be another referendum on the question of Brexit? We've asked this question in a consistent way for almost 2 years, and this following slide shows what has happened. The red line at the top are the people saying no, there should not be a second referendum. The blue line is people saying yes, there should be a second referendum. The black line at the bottom is people saying don't know or unsure. And what we've seen for most of the period from September 2016 is a clear balance of opinion in favour of, there should not be another vote on this issue. That reflected the overwhelming majority of people who voted Leave in 2016, rejecting the idea of a second vote, but also a significant number of people who voted Remain, for the most part were still pro-Remain, but nonetheless felt that the decision has been taken and there should not be a second vote. However, from autumn last year, we saw these two lines coming closer together, and indeed in one poll, there actually being a very marginal crossover between the two lines. Some of that reflects probably random fluctuation from poll to poll. But the broad picture is that from last summer, autumn, we've seen the gap between no to a second referendum and yes being much closer. Nonetheless, it's still true to say that in all but one poll conducted in Wales since the 2016 referendum, more people have opposed the idea of a second vote than have supported it. So there's not a great deal of change there. On the basic issue of Remain versus Leave, though, polls conducted from almost immediately after the 2016 referendum right through to the present day have asked people, well, what do you feel about the basic issue of Remain versus Leave? We've essentially used the same question wording that was used in the referendum and kept asking people, should the UK remain in the European Union or should it leave the European Union? The following slide shows what has happened since then. Again, the red line is for people supporting Leave, the blue line is for people supporting Remain, black is for people not answering the question or saying don't know. The main pattern we can see here is really not much of a pattern, i.e. not much change. A little bit of fluctuation from poll to poll, but for the vast majority of the time, the two lines remaining very close together, just as they were for the period before the referendum, and indeed just as it was in the referendum itself, where Wales narrowly voted in favour of Leave. We have seen in the past, I think at 6 polls, Remain has been in the lead in all of them, but in all cases that's been a narrow lead, no more than a few percentage points. In the latest poll, it's just a 5 percentage point for Remain. That suggests that at most there has been, in the 2 years since the referendum of June 2016, a very modest shift in Wales in the direction of Remain, and no greater change than that. Finally, though, I want to present a slightly more complicated slide to you, which looks at what has happened in the last 2 years in Wales in terms of the relationship between views on Brexit and patterns of party support. So I'm going to compare in this next slide people who said they would support the Labour Party, the Conservative Party and Plaid Cymru in a general election in Wales, and what has happened to patterns of party support 2 years ago with those in our most recent poll. Now, what we see here, the blue bars are people who favour Remain and red bars are people who favour Leave. Now, for the Conservative Party, overall their support in our most recent Welsh Political Barometer poll, published a couple of weeks ago, is a little bit higher than it was 2 years ago. But actually amongst people who favour Remain, Conservative support has dropped slightly. What has happened is that Conservative support has increased very substantially by almost 25 percentage points amongst people who favour Leave. The Conservative Party in Wales has become much more the party of Leave. And a lot of these people who are now supporting the Conservatives are people who 2 years ago in Wales were supporting UKIP. Meanwhile, the Labour Party has seen its support rise in the last 2 years in Wales. That has come in almost equal proportions from people who favour either Remain or Leave. And to some degree, I mean, we see at the end of the bar chart here, Plaid Cymru actually never had much support from people who voted Leave, and that has remained unchanged. As the Labour Party support levels have risen, Plaid Cymru, although they're very much a pro-Remain party, have actually lost a little bit of support amongst Remainers. That has drained away to the Labour Party. But I think the key story there is the changing nature of Conservative Party support in Wales. I'd now like to move on to look at some evidence from British-wide opinion polls and surveys, and start off by looking at the position across Britain on the basic question of Remain versus Leave. There have been a very large number of opinion polls carried out on this, using a number of different question wordings. And I'm going to present to you a couple of different slides, both of them taken from the excellent website run by my friend Sir John Curtis called What UK Thinks EU. If you're not familiar with it, you should take every effort to become so. So first of all, this is the aggregation of a whole series of opinion polls, I think more than 60 of them, conducted from autumn 2016 onwards, that have asked people, in hindsight, was it wrong for the UK to vote to leave the European Union? And on this bar chart, if I remember rightly, the blue bars, I think it is, are the ones. Blue is for those people who say, no, we were right to vote to leave the EU. Green is for people saying, no, we were wrong to vote to leave the European Union. The bottom squiggly line is for people, again, taking a neutral, unsure position. And what we've seen roughly for the first half of the period shown on this bar chart is things being very close, but tending to be a very narrow lead for people saying Britain was right to vote to leave the European Union. In the last year or so, the last 9 months, we tended to have the green bar charts, the green line on the chart slightly ahead. That's basically a narrow lead for people saying, no, actually Britain was wrong to vote to leave the European Union. But the big picture, I think, on this chart is that on this particular question wording, not much change. Again, as we saw in Wales, if anything, just a very small change in the direction of people taking a more negative view of the Brexit vote. And this following bar chart, this uses, as we've done in the Welsh polls, the same question wording, basically, that was used in the referendum. We've seen here this bunch of charts that run from autumn 2016. Again, very little change. In the last few months, we've tended to see a very modest lead for Remain in most of the polls, Remain being marginally ahead of Leave. But the basic picture is overwhelmingly of stability, at most a very small change in the direction of people thinking that actually maybe now we should vote to remain in the European Union. But basically not a great deal has changed. One thing has changed, though, and changed very substantially, and that is public evaluations of how the Brexit process is being handled by the UK government. And in the following chart, which again aggregates a significant number of polls conducted from April last year onwards, oh, sorry, actually, I've got another bar chart, I forgot. Before we get, this is the very latest evidence from the most recent poll. Is the government handling the issue of Brexit well or badly? The red bar is for those people saying well, the blue bar is for people saying badly. Some of you may be surprised to find that YouGov in their poll last week actually found as many as 13% of people saying that the government was handling the Brexit process well. Nonetheless, the overwhelming majority, 75% of the entire sample, suggested that the government was handling the Brexit process badly. And this line chart shows what has happened over the past 15 months. The green line at the top, which is gradually going upwards, that is the proportion of people saying that the government is handling the Brexit process badly. That has been rising. It rose during last year, sort of plateaued out again, and has then risen again in the last few months. So evaluations of the handling of the Brexit process by the UK government have become increasingly negative over the last year and more. And now it is the overwhelming majority of people. This is the one thing that unites Remainers and Leavers. Both Remainers and Leavers think that Brexit is being handled badly by the UK government. The final body of evidence I'd like to talk to you about is evidence that was published in detail last week. This comes from the British Social Attitudes Survey, a very detailed, in-depth, high-quality social survey which is conducted over several months each year. What was released last week is, in fact, last year's British Social Attitudes Survey data. So this is not up-to-the-minute evidence, but it's detailed, high-quality evidence which goes up to the end of last year. And there are a number of interesting things there, I think, on attitudes towards immigration, the links of that and some other things to attitudes towards Brexit, and then the link of all of this to patterns of party support in the UK. I'll first of all show you a couple of charts about attitudes towards immigration in the UK. We know that immigration was a big factor shaping voting patterns in June 2016. Those taking a negative view of the impact of immigration in the UK in recent years were much more likely to vote for Brexit than those who took a neutral or more positive view. But actually, if we look at what's happened in recent years in terms of attitudes towards immigration, there's a somewhat surprising picture. The British Social Attitude Survey has every 2 years from 2011 asked a couple of basic questions about what is the impact of immigration on, well, this first one is about the impact of immigration on the British economy. So the red line is people saying that on balance, the impact of immigration on the British economy is bad. The blue line is a percentage of people saying that the overall impact of immigration on the British economy is good. And contrary to the impression that you might get from much popular discussion of this, attitudes towards immigration, particularly from 2013 onwards, according to the British Social Attitude Survey, have become substantially more positive. We see a clear crossover in the two lines there, with growing perceptions in the British public that the overall balance of the impact of immigration on the British economy is a good thing rather than a bad thing. Similarly, if we look at British social attitudes evidence on the cultural impact of immigration. Is the impact on Britain's cultural life overall, does it enrich Britain's cultural life? That's the blue line. Does it diminish it, make it worse? That's the red line. We see the change here is not quite so dramatic as for the economic impact, but we see change in the same direction. Somewhat surprisingly, perhaps, attitudes towards immigration in Britain, particularly over the last 4 years, or the 4 years leading up to 2017, have become more positive. I'll come back to this in a few minutes. I'm going to show you a chart now. This is a line chart of... this relates to a question that's been asked for many years by the British Social Attitude Survey, where they've given people a number of different options and said, well, which of these would come closest to your view in terms of how Britain should relate to the European Union? And their answers went from, at one end of the spectrum, Britain should be a full member of a unified European state, through to the other end of the spectrum, Britain should leave the European Union. And the line chart here is the people who are taking the most anti-EU position in those surveys, that Britain should leave the European Union. What the line chart here shows is that up until 2012, leave was the position adopted by really quite a small minority of the British population. The first noticeable upward spike in this chart is in 2012. It drifts slightly downwards after then to 2015. And then the big upward spike towards the end is the survey that was conducted in 2016. A very slight fall in the survey conducted last year. What I'm really interested in here is the stuff towards the end of this line chart, the large increase after 2015 in the proportion of people, as opinions crystallized around the EU referendum, large increase in the proportion of people saying that Britain should leave the European Union, rather than we should stay in but reduce its powers, or stay in as things are, or even go towards further European unity. Now, where did this increase in support for leave come from? Amongst what social and attitudinal groups did it come from? So first of all, in this bar chart, I'm looking at changes in support for this leave option amongst people's views on immigration. And what this chart shows is that people who thought that immigration had enriched Britain's cultural life, amongst those people, we saw very little increase between 2015 and 2017 in support for leaving the European Union. We saw noticeably larger increases in support for leave amongst people who took a neutral view on that, but clearly the biggest increase was in people who believed that immigration damaged, undermined British cultural life. People with a negative view about immigration. So that's where we saw some of the big increase in support for leave. Similarly, if we look at social attitudes, the British Social Attitude Survey divides its respondents into three broad categories. Those who are socially liberal, those who are in some indeterminate middle position, and those who are socially conservative, or, as they put it, authoritarian. And amongst social liberals, there was almost no rise at all in support for leave from 2014 through to 2017. Amongst those in the intermediate position, there was a much bigger rise, but again, by far the greatest rise in support for leave came from social conservatives and authoritarians. If we look at age groups, not much of a rise in support for leave amongst the youngest people they interviewed, 18 to 34-year-olds. Amongst those in intermediate age category, a somewhat larger support rise in support for Leave, but by far the biggest rise in support for their oldest respondents, those aged 55 and above. And if we look at education, not much of a rise in support for Leave amongst those with degree level or A-level education, much bigger rises in support for Leave amongst those whose highest educational qualification was GCSE or equivalent, or those indeed who left school without any formal qualifications at all. And what all of this starts to show, I'll come back to in a second, but one final slide here on changes in party support then, between the general election of 2015 and the general election of 2017. For the Conservative Party, we saw that they increased their support amongst people who supported Leave. That's the red bar here. A significant increase in Conservative support there, in particular in 2017, as they were attracting large numbers of votes back from people who in 2015 had voted for UKIP. But the blue and black bars here, the blue people who took what used to be known as a moderate Eurosceptic position, people who thought that Britain should stay in the EU but that the EU's powers maybe should be reduced. The black position is people who are most pro-European. Amongst those groups, the Conservative Party support fell between 2015 and 2017. Again, across Britain, as in Wales, as I showed earlier, the Conservative Party has become much more the party of Leave in the electorate. For the Labour Party, perhaps reflecting its rather ambiguous position on Brexit, it actually saw its support rise a little bit amongst people who are pro-Leave, but also rise amongst those who thought that Britain should remain within the European Union. And for the Liberal Democrats, the only group amongst whom they saw any significant rise in support at all between 2015 and 2017 is the most pro-European respondents, the British Social Attitudes Survey. So what does all of this add up to? Overall, we've seen very little change, either in Wales or across Britain, in terms of the balance between Remain and Leave. At most, we see, in the last 2 years, a very modest move in the direction of Leave. But that's the strongest claim we can make for any changes in public attitudes. And that's an aggregate stability that, as I said, reflects substantial individual level stability. Most people who were pro-Remain 2 years ago are still pro-Remain. Most people who were pro-Leave are still pro-Leave. We are seeing clear change and substantial change in terms of faith in the UK government's handling of Brexit. That has declined very substantially. But we are also seeing Brexit views on whether the European Union and Britain should part ways increasingly linked to factors like age, education and social attitudes. A clear finding in research conducted on how people voted in the referendum 2 years ago was that people who voted Leave tended to be older, they tended to be less well educated, they tended to be more socially conservative and anti-immigration. Those who voted Remain tended to be younger, more well educated, more socially liberal. And if anything, in the period since then, those associations have strengthened. Leave is, to an even greater extent now than it was 2 years ago, an attitude that is supported by older, less well-educated, more socially conservative voters. And the Remain position is supported by younger, more well-educated, more socially liberal voters, to an even greater extent than was the case 2 years ago. And finally, Brexit is contributing to a changed party politics. In particular, the nature of the support of the Conservative Party has altered. They've lost support in general amongst those who favour and continue to favour Britain remaining within the European Union. And they've become within the country much more the party of Leave. So what conclusion does this lead us to? Well, Theresa May suggested rather optimistically early in the general election campaign last year that the country is coming together over Brexit. That is one view. I'd like to put to you an alternative view suggested some time ago by one of her predecessors, both as Conservative leader and as Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, who talked about two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones, or even inhabitants of different planets. And I'll leave it to you to reflect on which of these two quotes you think more accurately reflects the position of the public in Wales and Britain on Brexit. Diolch yn fawr iawn.